our speaker. Who's going to talk on Bayesian babies. Alison Gopnik has written some really amazing books. My wife was impressed to find out that she was on the Charlie Rose show, but she tells me that her kids weren't impressed by that at all. It took being on the Colbert Report to impress them. You know, what can you say? The names of the books that she has written are The Scientist in the Crib, The Philosophical Baby, What Children's Minds Tell Us About Love, Truth, and the Meaning of Life. And she's written for, you know, the New York Times and some other things that I would find impressive, but her kids don't. So there you go. She started out in philosophy, and she moved into psychology, and then started collaborating with, of all people, computer scientists and software developers. Spare her soul. With that, Alison.
Well, thank you all very much for inviting me and for coming out. So what I'm going to do is talk about some work that my colleagues and I have been doing over the past 15 years or so, looking at babies and very young children, 2, 3, and 4-year-olds, and trying to figure out what it is that they do that enables them to learn so much. And one of the things that we all sort of take for granted is that babies and young children are the best learners we know of in the universe, much better at learning than any other creatures that we know of. And as I'll try and show later on, pretty clearly better at learning than we are as adults, and certainly better at learning than any of the machine learning systems that we know. So one of the questions that you can ask is, how is it possible for children to learn as much as they do? And as was mentioned, I started out my career actually as a philosopher. And again, there's this big central problem, which is the central problem in philosophy, going back to Plato and Aristotle, the central problem in machine learning, and the central problem in developmental psychology. And you might call it the problem of knowledge. And that's the fact that we seem to have very abstract, general, generative knowledge of the world around us that we can use to make predictions, to do things in the world. And yet somehow we seem to learn that knowledge from the very specific concrete experiences that we have. And there's always been this tension about how is that possible? How can we get to that kind of abstract generative knowledge from what looks like very degenerative concrete particulars? And one of the reasons for looking at children to answer this question is because we know that they actually are the ones that do it. So they're the ones that actually start out being born in the world and somehow take just those vibrations of air at their eardrums and photons hitting their retinas and turn them into the kind of everyday knowledge of a world of people and things and events that we all take for granted. So the great mystery is, how is it conceivable? How is it possible for them to do this? But there's actually another interesting mystery when we start thinking about childhood and taking childhood seriously. And that mystery is, why is it that we actually have childhood at all? Well, we all know why we have children proximately, but why is it that we have children from the perspective of evolution? Well, one of the things that's kind of mysterious is that we have this period in which we can't do very much. We're basically pretty useless, and in fact arguably worse than useless, because adults have to put so much time and energy into just taking care of these immature young. And that problem is particularly puzzling for human beings because we actually have a longer childhood, a longer period of immaturity by a substantial margin than any other creature does, and by a really substantial margin, compared to other primates. Why would this be? Well, it turns out that if you look across the animal kingdom, you see an interesting correlation. And that's a correlation between how long a period of childhood, of immaturity, an animal has, and how smart the adult animal is. In particular, how much the adult animal is engaged in learning. So the poster animals for this relationship are not actually humans or even primates, they're birds. And if you look across birds, some birds like corvids, crows, ravens, rooks, are incredibly smart. And this in particular is a New Caledonian crow, a crow lives in New Caledonia, who is able to do things like actually use tools, bend these wires to get something. The latest studies suggest that these crows are even smarter than chimpanzees in some ways. In contrast, the whole family of the domestic chicken and ducks and geese and turkeys and a whole bunch of other related animals, basically chickens are kind of dumb as stumps. They're good at pecking for grain. They're not much good at doing anything else. And when you look at their babies, their fledglings, the crow fledglings are immature for as long as a year, which is a long time in the life of a crow. The New Caledonian crows are immature for as long as 2 years, which is a very long time in the life of an animal, whereas the chicken chicks are mature within the space of a couple of months. And this seems to be very, very generally true across many, many different animals. In fact, if you even look at marsupials, there's a recent study in PNAS. This is a quokka, which is a strange marsupial that lives in Australia, and this is a possum, another strange marsupial. And even among these marsupials, the quokkas actually, even though they're about the same size as the possums, have brains that are twice as big, and they have babies who stay in the pouches for twice as long. So there seems to be this general relationship. In fact, if you look at our evolutionary history, one of the things that seems to have been characteristic of us is that this period of immaturity actually got longer, even if you compare human beings, Homo sapiens, to Neanderthals. So this is based on looking at the age of fossil teeth, and based on looking at these fossil teeth, you can see that the Neanderthals seem to have even been maturing somewhat faster than our human ancestors did. So it looks like there's something going on there. There's something about that long period of immaturity that's related to our particular cognitive abilities. And the idea that most people in evolutionary biology have about this is that the reason for having a protected period of immaturity is that it goes along with an evolutionary strategy of relying a lot on learning. So there are some animals, like the chickens, who are incredibly good at doing just one thing over and over again, not very good at learning new things. And then there are other animals, like the crows, or like us, who are not very good at doing anything in particular, but are very good at learning how to do new things in lots of different circumstances. And the idea is that that's a very powerful strategy. It's the strategy that's let us be so successful. But it has one big drawback. And the drawback is that while you're actually doing all of that learning, you're going to be helpless. You're not going to have any idea what to do. So you don't want to actually have the mastodon be charging at you and be saying to yourself, what should I do about this mastodon? I could use a slingshot, or maybe I could use an arrow. You want to have actually done that learning before you actually have to face the realities. So the picture is that we have this early protected period where we can do what in machine learning they talk about as exploration learning. And then what we can do is later on take that exploration learning and use it to do processes that are more like exploit processes, where we're actually trying to figure out trying to learn in the service of choosing the best planning option. And it's interesting that if you look at machine learning as well, you very often see that a good way of solving problems is to have an early period where you have lots of possibilities for exploring lots of different hypotheses. Once you've had a chance to explore the space of hypotheses, you narrow in on a narrower range of hypotheses that you actually want to explore. So my slogan about this is that you could think about babies and young children as being like the research and development division of the human species. So they're actually designed to do lots of exploration, do a lot of blue sky exploration in this period when they're completely protected and taken care of and don't have to worry about bringing product to market. And then we, as adults, can actually take all of those discoveries that they've made and use them. We're more like production and marketing. We have to take all the discoveries that the blue sky boffins, as they used to say in England, have figured out and actually put them to work to do the things that we need to do for evolution. In fact, if you look at the development of the human brain, you see a pattern that fits this picture that I've been talking about. So this is a graph that shows you the number of neural connections at various ages of development. And what you can see is that there's an early period where there's many, many, many new connections being formed. This is sort of the explore period. And then for different parts of the brain, what happens is that The connections that are used a lot get maintained and kept, and the connections that aren't used a lot get pruned, so that you see that the brain turns from being this very general, plastic, multifunctional kind of system to being a lean machine that's just very, very good at doing some things very swiftly and effectively and quickly. And you can see that this happens in different ways for different parts of the, brain. All right, so if that's the picture that comes from evolution and from neuroscience, this picture of childhood as this period of exploration, a period that's literally for learning, children are for learning from an evolutionary perspective, we might ask ourselves the question, what kinds of computations are they doing that are allowing them to learn as much as they do, as effectively as they do early on? And over the past 15 years or so, my colleagues and I have been suggesting that the babies are using some of the same kinds of ideas that were originally formulated in the work of the Reverend Thomas Bayes. You'll notice that his haircut is kind of like the baby's as well. So if you want to know what's going on inside of that beautiful face, it's something like this. This is actually the original page from the Reverend Bayes' notebooks. Unconsciously, those babies and young children are doing really sophisticated kinds of computations and calculations that let them learn as much as they do. And in particular, we think that what they're doing is using techniques that have been called different things, but most broadly, you could refer to as probabilistic models. So the idea is that children have structured generative models of the world around them, and those structured generative models generate particular kinds of hypotheses about the world, and then the children take those hypotheses, test them against the evidence that they see in the world around them, update the probability of those hypotheses given the evidence that they see around them, and repeat and repeat and repeat until they've actually figured out something about how the world works. Probabilistic models are helpful because, first of all, they provide computational accounts of inference. They tell you how you can make predictions, and in particular, how you can make counterfactual kinds of inferences. And they also provide computational accounts of learning. So they also tell you how you could get a model that will let you do this kind of inference from data. And what we've been doing for the past 15 years or so is showing at some length, there's a review paper that I have about this that just came out in last month's issue of Science that reviews this 15 years of work by me and my lab and by others. What we've been showing is rather remarkably, even very young children are implicitly using some of these very powerful probabilistic model techniques. They're constructing things that look like causal graphical models of the world around them, and they're updating them in a way that looks like Bayesian inference. Now, you might say, how on earth could we possibly know this about little kids? One of the things that we know about even grown-ups is that grown-ups have an incredibly hard time understanding ideas like statistics and probability. My colleague, Danny Kahneman, got the Nobel Prize for showing how stupid we mostly are as adults about probability. So how could we possibly say that babies and young children understand these ideas? Well, part of it is that we certainly know that we couldn't ask 3- and 4-year-olds things like, do you think that conditional probabilities are related to causal structure? And in fact, we wouldn't even be as foolish as to ask them, how probable do you think this is? We know very well that they would just kind of look at us blankly if we asked them a question like that. So we have to figure out how to ask children questions in their language instead of in our language. And the secret for this has turned out to be that what we do is give children very simple problems to solve, problems that involve real-life objects. And this is our basic research technique. It's a box that lights up and plays music when you put some things on it, but not other things on it. And the secret is that there's actually a graduate student behind a curtain who's pressing a button to make the box light up when we want it to light up and not when we don't want it to light up. And it turns out with this very simple device that looks like, so we give children patterns of evidence about how this toy works, and then we just see what they do when they actually are trying to activate the toy. So we don't even have to use very much language. A lot of the time, the children are just seeing a pattern of events and then trying to figure out what they need to do to make the toy work. And let me show you a lovely example. So as I say, we've done 10 or 15 years of work on this. One of the things that we've discovered is that when children just play with these toys, something that we've all seen children doing, actually, if you look more carefully, you can see that they're really systematically testing different causal hypotheses in the way that we proposed. And let me just give you one example of this. This comes from work from Christine Laguerre at the University of Texas at Austin. And she gave children these, look at the teachers, and gave them a bit of a problem and saw if they could solve it.
This makes that light up the box. How about this? That makes the other side. Uh-oh. Nothing. This one's lighting up and this one's not. So that means...
So this little boy is trying to explain why one of these red ones isn't working, the box isn't lighting up. And he's 4.
Oh, it's because this needs to be like this, and this needs to be like that. That's why. Oh, why the boxes are the wrong way?
Now this is his suggestion. He said probably the boxes are the wrong way, and he suggested to the experimenter that they put them both in the same place.
What should we do now?
Oh, because the light goes only to here, not here. Oh, the bottom of this box has electricity in here, but this doesn't have electricity. It's lighting up. So we need to put 4. So we need to put 4 on this one to make it light up and 2 on this one to make it light up.
Okay, so part of the reason for that is that that little boy is kryptonite cute, as Christine says. But in addition to being cute, you can see that if you look at what he's doing, and this is just sitting there and playing, what he's actually doing is systematically testing out hypotheses, doing the kinds of things that he'd need to do to get the evidence that would tell him which hypothesis was correct. And a whole series of experiments that Christine has done, that my ex-student Laura Schultz, who's now at MIT, has done, has shown that these kinds of playful interventions actually are designed to give children the kind of evidence that they need to be able to test these hypotheses. One thing that you might notice—
Why does it not light up?
Oh, sorry, I should have said that. So the way this experiment worked was that, to begin with, she showed them that yellow ones made it go and red ones didn't make it go.
So she didn't tell them in the beginning.
In the very beginning. And then they saw an anomaly. So then they saw that one of the red ones actually did not make it go. And if you look through the video, that's what's wrong. If you don't have both of the, you don't have the active red one on the machine, then it won't go. If you have the inactive red one on the machine, then it won't go. And that was actually the explanation for why it was going and it wasn't. So one of the red ones made it go and one of them didn't. And what happened was that she just asked the child to explain why it was that there was this failure. He didn't actually think about the possibility that the 2 red ones functioned differently, but he thought about a whole lot of other possible hypotheses about how the machine could work. And in fact, I think I counted over the space of the 2 minutes of this, he goes through 8 different hypotheses, including many of them that I think it's highly unlikely that an adult would get if they were trying to solve the same problem, like it's the orientation of the objects. So not only does he seem to be testing hypotheses, but he seems to be testing a really wide range of hypotheses, arguably a wider range of hypotheses than an adult would test. And to some extent, he seems to be sort of bouncing around from one hypothesis to another. All right, that's kind of anecdotal. You're looking at the picture, although there have also been more systematic experiments. But we also wanted to see if we could show that children were doing this kind of hypothesis testing more systematically. And in particular, we wanted to see if the children would use probability to try to solve these problems, which try and consider probabilistic evidence for these hypotheses rather than just deterministic evidence. And really, the great advance in cognitive science over the last little while has been this idea that you could use probability theory, you could use Bayesian methods to tell you which hypotheses were more likely than other hypotheses. So to do this, my student Tamara Kushner and I set up the following experiment. We showed children a Blickett detector. First, we asked them, how do you think this detector works? And when we did that, all of the children actually put a block on the detector to make it work, which is what most of us would think. Then what we did was we gave children evidence that was probabilistic, but that weighed against that initial hypothesis. So what we showed the children was that this red block activated the machine 2 out of 3 times if you waved it over the machine without making contact. This blue block, on the other hand, also activated the machine, but it only activated the machine 2 out of 6 times, even though it actually did make contact with the detector. Okay. So in terms of a kind of Bayesian inference mechanism, the initial prior would make you prefer this as an option for making the machine go. But the evidence that you got actually told you that this hypothesis that you wave it on top actually had better support, better probabilistic support than the evidence, even though both of these are just probabilistic relationships. Notice also that we designed the experiment so in each case the children saw that the block made it go 2 times. The difference was in these occasions when the block was not making it go. So in order to actually figure out that the conditional probability of the block lagging was greater in this case than in that case, children were going to have to do some calculations. We did this with 4-year-olds, and what we discovered was that the 4-year-olds chose then we just asked the children to make the machine go. And what they did was wave the red block over top of the machine about 70% of the time and make contact with the blue block about 30% of the time. So the children, first of all, these 4-year-olds who were just barely adding and subtracting seemed to be able to do the calculations to figure out conditional probabilities. And they seemed to be able to use that probabilistic evidence to overturn their initial hypothesis about how the machine worked. And it's at least suggestive that if you look at the proportion of times they choose red and blue, it seems to be sort of similar to the proportion of times that the red and the blue machine activate the machine. Now that could, of course, just be a coincidence. The children are often noisy. But we thought, well, let's see if that actually is reflecting something about the probability of one event happening versus the probability of another event happening. And I'll just mention parenthetically, part of the reason why we did this was because we wanted to see if children might be actually sampling different hypotheses about how the machine worked, which is a technique that's very commonly used to try to solve Bayesian inference problems in machine learning. But for the moment, I'm just going to emphasize how this experiment shows how sophisticated the children are about probability. So this time what we did was we had a sort of version of our Blickett detector. This is a machine that lights up and spins around when different chips go in. And the children saw that both red chips and blue chips actually make the machine go. Then what happened was that we showed the children this bucketful, transparent bucketful of chips. And the chips were in a particular distribution. So in this case, there were 4 times as many red chips as there are blue chips. And then the chips got counted into an opaque bag. And then they mixed up the chips, put them in the bag. And then the bag tips off, and when the bag tips off, the machine goes. And the question is, what do you think fell into the machine? Did a blue chip fall into the machine, or did a red chip fall into the machine? Now, what you should figure out, of course, is that the probability that it's a blue chip or red chip depends on the distribution of blue chips and red chips in the bag. Right? But of course, to do that, you have to think about the relationship between a sample and a distribution. So what you say is if the distribution was 4-to-1, then it was more likely that you would pull out a red chip than a blue chip. And what we did was actually vary the proportion of red chips and blue chips so that we could control the probability of the hypothesis of its being a red chip versus the probability of the hypothesis of its being a blue chip. Does everybody kind of got that? And then what we did was we asked the children to give us several guesses about what was in the machine. So we said first, all right, what do you think is in the machine, red or blue? And then we said, okay, that's good, you want to guess again, what do you think is in the machine, red or blue, and so forth, over several different occasions. And what we discovered was that here's the response you'd expect if the children were actually matching their responses to the probability of the two hypotheses. And in fact, although there was a little bit of noise, the children's responses matched that probability. So in other words, about 90% of the time, if there was a 90% probability that it was red, they said red, and about 10% of the time they said blue. If it was 70-30, then they said red less often, and so forth. And we did a number of other control experiments to show this was true. Well, maybe the children were just using a sort of simpler strategy. They weren't really thinking about the probability of the hypotheses. Maybe they were just sort of thinking about how many blue things are there in general versus how many red things are there in general. So in the next experiment, what we did was we showed the children two buckets. One had 14 red and 6 blue. One had 2 blue. And then what we did was take the 2 buckets, put them behind our back, and kind of do an eeny, meeny, miny, mo of swapping the buckets. And then we said, all right, we'll just pick this bucket. And now the bucket is opaque. The kids don't know which bucket we picked. And again, it tips over into the machine and makes the machine go. Now, if you think about this case, then in this case, the probability of there being a blue block is actually much greater than it was in the other case, right? Because now there's a 50% chance that it's this bucket, and this bucket is only blue. So even though there's many fewer blue chips than red chips in this experiment, it's actually more likely that you'll get a blue chip than it is that you'll get a red chip. I don't know if, again, presumably all of you smart people will be able to get this. I was absolutely sure that this was going to be impossible for the kids. And as usual, my graduate students, in this case my wonderful postdoc Liz Bonowitz, proved me completely wrong, because what we found was that the children's responses were matching the 50% probability rather than matching the total distribution. So what the children did was actually say, so this is the prediction that they choose if they were just doing this kind of naive frequency matching. But if they were actually calculating 50% times 100% versus 50% times whatever the other one was, 70%, then this would be the prediction. And in fact, the children's predictions were very similar to that. So the children seem to be not only paying attention to probability, but actually doing these kinds of calculations that said, that allowed them to do conditional probability calculations. All right, so far what we've shown is that the kids are very, very good at understanding probability in this implicit way. Oh, by the way, another interesting thing, part of the point about it being implicit, we also asked the kids, why did you choose red? Why did you choose blue? And when we asked the kids, what they said was, red is the color of flowers, blue is my favorite color, it's like the sky. In fact, they almost never even referred to the distribution of red and blue chips in the bag, even though their actual behavior was beautifully, exactly tracking the distribution of the blue and red chips. So you can sort of see why people might have thought for all these years, as for example, the great psychologist Jean Piaget did, that the kids weren't very good at being able to do things like understand probabilities, because if you asked them, they never would refer to anything about distributions and probabilities.
Would they have the capability of doing it? Would they have the background to be able to formulate that sort of response, do you think?
Well, I mean, they could, they wouldn't have said it's probable, but at least you think they might have said, oh, there's a lot more red ones than there are blue ones.
Sure.
And they didn't even ever refer to the distribution of the red ones and blue ones at all, which was interesting, which I didn't necessarily expect, but that is in fact the way it came out. Yeah, they couldn't have been explicit about probability, but they could have said it's something about the distribution that's leading to this, and in fact they didn't. Okay, so I mentioned before that this idea about exploration versus exploitation And as I mentioned, very often it turns out that in machine learning, if you're trying to search through a space of hypotheses, a good way to do it is to start out with what people call a high temperature search. A search, the idea behind a high temperature search is when you're doing a high temperature search, you bounce around the space a lot, kind of like molecules at high temperature. So you're not going to settle on any particular hypothesis very well. You're going to try out lots of them, and even with a little bit of evidence, you'll go off to another part of the space. And you may go off to quite distant parts of the space, so parts of the space that start out being quite low probability. Nevertheless, you might try those at some point or another. If you're doing a low temperature search, you're more likely to search just in the space that you think is most likely. So not go off and try things that are wild, unlikely possibilities. Just search to the things that you think are most likely to turn out to actually be true. And it turns out that in machine learning, so there's a kind of trade-off between these two strategies. If you use a high temperature search, you're more likely to stumble on the unexpected hypothesis that turns out to be true. If you just do a low temperature search, you may never get out to the part of the space that's unlikely but actually turns out to be true. But if you do a high temperature search, you may waste a lot of time trying a lot of hypotheses and possibilities that actually aren't going to turn out to be very useful. And it turns out that one of the best ways of solving this intrinsic tension, this dilemma, is to start out with the wide search, the high temperature search, and then narrow in on the lower temperature search. And people in machine learning call this simulated annealing. It's like what happens in metal when you heat it up and then cool it, and that gives you a more robust system. So the hypothesis that my colleagues and I have been thinking about for the last little while is that you could think about childhood as being like evolution's way of performing simulated annealing. We have this early period when we can do these impractical general searches, and we can do them because we don't have to worry about actually getting on in the world because our parents take care of us. And then this later period in adulthood where we narrow our search. So we wanted to see if this might be true. In fact, the evidence for this came about from an experiment that was not particularly designed to test this hypothesis, but to test a different question. So I've shown you so far that the children are very good at doing things like figuring out, does the blue one make it go or does the red one make it go? But of course, one of the things that we do as scientists is to try to infer these much more abstract principles about how things work. Not just, for example, does the red one make it go, does the blue one make it go, but how does this machine work in general? For instance, is this a deterministic machine or is this a probabilistic machine? Does this machine work with a noisy OR principle or does it work with an AND principle, which is the one that we're going to consider here? And one of the really big problems for any kind of learning system is that you have to not just learn specifics, you have to learn some of these more general, what are sometimes called framework principles or theories. And hierarchical Bayes nets or hierarchical Bayesian inference gives you a formal way of being able to learn these higher order ideas. So we wanted to see if kids could do some of the same things. Oh, and I should mention, in some of the computational work, rather strikingly, it turns out you actually can be more successful if you're trying to do both levels of learning at once than if you just do one. So often you can figure out some more abstract general principle about how a system works, even before you figure out all of the particulars. So to do this, we went back to our trusty Blicket detector, and I can get you people in the audience to actually do the experiment. Here's what the kids, both adults and kids, see. You see D is a block, it goes on the detector, nothing happens. It goes on the detector again, nothing happens. It goes on again, nothing happens. E goes on, nothing happens. And now you put D and F together on the detector, it lights up, and you put D and F together on the detector again, and it lights up. So here's the question. Is D a Blicket? Show of hands.
Is D what?
A Blicket. We start out by saying Blicketness makes the machine go. So we can ask is D a Blicket? How about E? Is E a Blicket?
No.
Is F a Blicket?
Yes.
Okay.
Depends.
It's at least a partial Blicket.
Yeah,
Okay.
it depends on how you
It depends, yeah.
All right, so this was a little bit of a setup, but okay, so now suppose, and this is relevant to your comment, now suppose that you saw these events first. You saw this sequence of events first. So what you saw was A, B, and C go on the detector, nothing happens. A and B go on the detector. Now A and C go on the detector, and the detector activates, and B and C go on, and nothing happens. So you see this sequence of events first, and now you go back to the original question about which objects are blinkets. Well, if you see this sequence, you can see that in this case, the machine actually works on this conjunctive principle. So no individual block is sufficient to make the machine go, but a combination of blocks can make the machine go. So if you see that first, then you ought to think, oh, I see. The general principle this machine works on is not the OR principle. Either it makes it go, a block makes it go, or it doesn't. It's this AND principle. Combinations of blocks can make it go. And what we did was to do exactly that with 4-year-olds and University of California at Berkeley undergraduates. What we did was we either gave them this OR training or this AND training, and then we gave them the tests, which was exactly the sequence of events that I showed you. And what we discovered was that when we did that, here's the adult data and here's the children's data. On the OR case, the one that has a very high prior, adults and children look pretty much the same, pretty much the way that you guys were to begin with. They said D and E were unlikely to be blinkets and F was likely to be blinket. But on the AND case, the adults, the undergraduates, continued to act as if they thought that the machine worked on the OR principle. But the children actually took the data in hand and said that D was a blinket instead. And maybe I'll just quickly zoom through this, but then we thought, well, maybe was it something about the word blinket, that the adults were just interpreting the word blinket differently than the children were. So what we did next was we gave them a slightly more complicated pattern. Here's the test pattern. Now we've got 3 different events. And at this time, we asked them whether the objects were blinkets or not. But we also asked them, make it go. Okay, so at the end, we just gave them the 3 objects, and we said, can you make the machine go? So we asked, is it blinking or not? And which of these should we use to make the machine turn on? And let me show you. Here's that.
Very important for us to figure out which of these things are blinkets. So let's call this one circle. What should we call this one? Square. Square. And could we call it cube? Would that be okay? Yeah? And what about this one? What should we call this one? Ball. Okay, so do you want to see what happens? Let's see what happens when we put circle on the machine. Look at that. The machine turned on.
Let's make it.
Now let's see what happens when we put cube on the machine. The machine did not turn on. Now let's see what happens when we put ball on the machine, okay? Look at that. The machine turned on.
There's only 2 that made songs in way that didn't.
Okay, do you want to see some more things? Let's see what happens when
So
we
this
put
is the
circle
OR
and
training.
machine together. Look, the machine turned on. Now let's see what happens when we put circle and ball on the machine together. Look at that then, the machine turned on. Okay, now let's see what happens when we put cube and ball on the machine together. Oh look, the machine turned on. So then I have a question for you.
What if we put them all together?
That's a really good idea. Could we try that at the end? Would that be okay? Yeah? Okay. So, do you think that circle is a blanket or not a blanket? Yes, a blanket. And do you think that cube is a blanket or not a blanket? Not a blanket. And do you think that ball is a blanket or not a blanket? Yes.
Okay. And here's the test.
So it's very important for us to figure out which of these are blankets. Let's call this one cylinder. What should we call this one?
Hat.
A hat. And what should we call a party hat? We could call a party hat. And what should we call this one?
Rectangle.
Rectangle. Okay, so let's see what happens when we put cylinder on the machine. Look at that. The machine did not turn on. Let's see what happens when we put cylinder on the machine again.
Or the other
Turn
side.
on. The other side? We can try that later. Let's see what happens when we put cylinder on the machine one more time. Did not turn on. Now let's see what happens when we put party hat on the machine. You ready? Let's see.
Now, the main reason I'm putting you through all this is if you're an old like me, you have sort of forgotten
Okay, now let's see what
it was that they were
happens
doing,
when
he was doing in the beginning. I mean, this is a really complicated sequence of events to
machine turned on.
keep track of as we're watching it.
Okay, now let's see what happens when we put cylinder, party hat, and rectangle all in the machine together. Let's see. To get them all together. Ready? Look at that! The machine turned on. Okay, now let's see what happens when we put cylinder and rectangle in the machine together. Oh, Benny, the machine turned on. So Benny, I have a question for you. Do you think that cylinder is a blanket or not a blanket?
Not a blanket.
Not a blanket. And do you think party hat is a blanket or not a blanket?
Not a blanket.
Not a blanket. And do you think that rectangle is a blanket or not a blanket?
Blanket.
A blanket. So Benny, which of these should we use to make my machine turn on? Rectangle? Do you want to give it a try yourself? Yeah, you can go ahead. Were you right? You were right.
So that gives you a sense of what the kids are actually seeing. And what we did was we did the and training, the or training, and we also did a baseline where you didn't get any training at all, just had that test on.
When they didn't get any training, were they still shown exactly what
Exactly
to do,
the
or
same.
could they ever just do things on their own without anyone telling them that this is what happens or this is what happens?
Well, in the baseline, what happened was that they didn't see the training that indicated or and and, they just saw the
Right.
ambiguous one, and then we just said, now
But it was
make
still the
count.
person doing everything, so they
Right.
were never doing things themselves unless they were specifically asked, now you do it.
Right. What we did is, at the very end, as she said, so first we asked the children which one you want to do, and then we said, do whatever it is that you want. Now you can
Okay.
try.
And why was the music different?
That's just the detector, that's just the way the detector works, so.
Yeah, that I found very confusing,
Yeah.
because, depending on which objects are
So you
on.
might think that it was connected to the different kinds of
I might
music.
actually think that it may have made children, come up with extremely different ideas about what this
Right.
experiment is about.
Right.
That's just, a side thing. But it may not have truncated the data. It's just
Right.
an interesting choice.
Right.
Yeah. It confused me.
Well, I think that part of the point of this is you could imagine that this was a confusing task, right? I mean, it's not at all obvious how it is that this task is supposed to work and exactly why it is that you're being shown all three of them at once or the two combinations. But the children did not seem to find it confusing. So when we looked at the results, what we discovered was that I'll skip over the blanket ones and just get to the interventions. What we discovered was that in the baseline case, when they didn't know anything, both the children and the adults seemed to think it was most likely that just a single object would make the machine go. And when they got or training, again, the children even more than the adults were sure that you just used a single one to make it go. But when they got trained on and, once again, the children, but to a much lesser extent the adults, recognized that this was a conjunctive machine, that you actually had to actually put combinations of blocks on the machine. So the children were actually much better at, even in this rather complicated setup, they were actually much better at inferring this low probability hypothesis than the adults were. So even though both the children and adults started out thinking that you only needed to put one on, when they saw evidence, the children actually overturned their original assumption and got to this new unlikely hypothesis, whereas the adults stuck with the prior that they already had. And one of the things that we're trying to do now is we're trying to do some modeling. There's two possible explanations for this. One of them is that it could simply be that the priors are different, that the adults just have a much stronger prior, because after all, they've had much more experience with things like artifacts than children. Another possibility is this possibility that they're really searching in different temperatures, that the children are naturally more prone to try out the unlikely hypotheses than the adults are, which is what I'm rooting for. But we don't yet quite have the data to tell us which one of those is right. Okay. Let's skip over this. So far, everything that I've been talking about has been about children making inferences about the physical world, about things like blinkets and blinket detectors. And what I hope you can see from this is, again, these are 4-year-olds. They're not even in school yet, but they're already very sophisticated in their ability to draw conclusions from quite complicated and probabilistic kinds of patterns of data, including drawing some of these abstract kind of conclusions. But if you think about the world in which children and indeed human beings in general evolved, understanding about the physical world is sort of important, but what's really important is understanding the psychological world. And that's really one of the very hardest kinds of problems that we ever have to solve, figuring out what's going on inside the minds of other people. And back in the 1980s, I was one of the people who first started a field that's come to be called theory of mind, which was about how is it that children and indeed adults can ever figure out what's going on inside somebody else's head. I mean, if you think about it, as you look around this room now, what you're actually seeing are a bunch of bags of skin that are stuffed into pieces of cloth and draped across these chairs with little dots at the top that go back and forth and a hole underneath that opens and closes and makes noises. But of course that's math, right? That's crazy. Nobody ever sees other human beings that way. We look at those bags of skin and what we see are thoughts and desires and ideas and beliefs, and as we'll see, personality traits. We see people as having these internal psychological states. And it's always been a great philosophical puzzle about how it is that we ever manage to do that. How do we ever manage to figure out what's going on in somebody else's mind? And again, I think it's worth saying that this has been something that machine learning systems, for instance, have had trouble doing. People in robotics, for example, have discovered that if you could get a robot that could figure out what, say, someone who was training a robot wanted, you'd have a much better robot than a robot that is trying to figure that out just from the clues of what it is that the person is actually doing. So for the past 20 years, I and my colleagues have been trying to figure out, well, how do children figure things out, like what it is that people want, something that children do very naturally and spontaneously. But in the experiment that I'm going to tell you about now, instead of thinking about what people wanted, we wanted to see if children could make inferences about another important psychological fact about people. And that is the fact that they have personality traits. So all of us just take for granted the fact that some people are brave and some people are cowardly and some people are shy and some people are outgoing and some people are smart and some people are not so smart. And we just assume that these are internal traits that people have that are very consistent and stable and predictable and that affect a whole lot of the kinds of actions that we perform. It turns out that this tendency that we have to explain what people do in terms of these long-lasting individual personality traits has a lot of consequences for how we think about people and how we treat them. In fact, it can literally be a matter of life or death, because it turns out that very often, at least for Western adults, we treat people's actions as if they're the result of their personality traits, even when that isn't true, even when, for example, what they're doing is really the result of the situation that they find themselves in. So a dramatic example of this, when you looked at the Abu Ghraib torture cases, and you looked at the first news reports about them, they tended to think that the people who had committed the tortures must have had some strange personality traits. Those people must have been, the bad apples in the barrel, or must have been sadists, or must have had terrible evil tendencies. And it turns out that actually, if you put many people in that particular kind of stressful, authority-driven situation, they end up doing terrible things. And the situation was actually a better predictor of what people would do than their particular personality traits. So whether we explain what someone does in terms of their personality traits or in terms of the situation they find themselves in is really important for how we treat them and how we understand them. So we wanted to know when and how will children start understanding people in terms of these long-lasting personality traits. And there was quite a lot of literature that showed that children don't start understanding or thinking about people in terms of personality traits until they're about 7 or 8 years old, relatively late into the school age period. So if you ask a 4-year-old just spontaneously, you say to them something like, see, this little boy knocked over this other little boy, he was mean, the children will say, yeah, that was a mean thing to do. But then if you ask them, well, next week, is he likely to do something mean or likely to do something nice, the children don't think there's any particular reason to predict that he's going to be mean next week just because he was mean now. So we wanted to see if we could get children to think in terms of personality traits by giving them patterns of data, the way you would with a scientist. So here's what we did. We actually showed the children two little dolls, Sally and Josie, and two little toys, a skateboard and a scooter. And what we did was we showed the children different patterns of activity between the two dolls and the skateboard. So for example, what the children would see is that sometimes Josie would actually play on the skateboard. And we'd say, look, Josie's playing on the skateboard. And then they would see Sally. And Sally would get up to the skateboard and then back away. And then they'd see the same thing about the scooter. So, for instance, they might see that Josie actually plays on the scooter, but Sally backs away from the scooter. And children saw a probabilistic pattern of data where they saw 3 out of 4 times the doll would either play or not play. And the children saw 2 different patterns of correlation between what the person did and the activities. So in the first pattern, what the children saw was that Josie, for example, played on both toys 3 out of 4 times, and Sally avoided playing with the toy 3 out of 4 times. In the alternative data set, what they saw was that both of the children played, in the alternative, what they saw was that both of the children played on the scooter. Make sure I get this right. No, sorry, that's the toy condition. Okay, so that's the condition where they're either playing or not playing. I'm sorry. Okay, so in the doll condition, they saw that Josie played and Sally didn't play. In the toy condition, what they saw was that both of the children played on the skateboard, but neither of them would play on the scooter. And in the control condition, they saw that Josie would play on the skateboard and that Sally would not play on the scooter. So in this condition, you don't know anything in terms of the data about why it is that the children play. And then we simply asked the children, why didn't Sally play on the scooter? And why didn't Josie play on the scooter? So we just asked the children to explain the last action that the dolls produced. Now those different data patterns should give you different conclusions about what it was that caused the actions, right? So when you see the pattern in the doll case, that should tell you there's something about that individual person that is leading them to play or not play. In the toy case, the pattern of data should tell you it's not the person, it's the situation. It's whether it's a toy or a skateboard or a scooter, that's what's determining the person's action. So if you were a good scientist trying to just figure out these causes from these probabilistic patterns of data, you should draw different conclusions in those 2 cases. Everybody got that? I'm sorry, I scrambled out a little bit. And in the control condition, you shouldn't draw any conclusion at all. So what we did was we looked at the children's explanations, and the children produced 2 different kinds of explanations. Sometimes they produced what we call internal explanations. These were things about something about the person, how old they were, their size, their emotions, their experience, things that were specific to that person and consistent over time. And sometimes, like she knows how to ride a bike, or she's the big sister and she's the little sister. And sometimes, there were a lot of big sister and little sister, by the way, in these responses. We did this was with 4-year-olds. And sometimes they talked about things like the scooter is fun or the skateboard is well. Okay, so things about the situation. So what we did was we looked at the 4-year-olds' explanations in terms of the data pattern that they had. And what we discovered was that the 4-year-olds were actually extremely accurate at using the data pattern in the right way to draw the right conclusion about why the person behaved in the way they did. So when the data pattern in this doll condition suggested that it was something about the individual, they actually made up these things like she's the big sister and she's the little sister, or she knows how to ride a bike scooter and she doesn't know how to ride a scooter. But the things that they made up had this character of being trait-like explanations, trait-like causes. And just the opposite is true in the toy condition. And in the control condition, they were equally likely to give either an internal or an external explanation. So the 4-year-olds seem to be using this pretty complicated probabilistic pattern of data in the right way to try to draw conclusions about what was going on inside causally that would explain this pattern of data. What was going on inside of the person. Interestingly, however, when we looked at the 6-year-olds, we saw a very different pattern. So the 6-year-olds did pay attention to the data, so they were more likely to give internal explanations in the doll case than in the toy case. But overall, just like those adults making judgments about people in outer grade, the 6-year-olds showed this bias towards explaining things in terms of people's personality traits rather than explaining it in terms of the situation in which they found themselves. So what seemed to have happened when we actually did some simple Bayesian modeling of this is that the 6-year-olds had a much higher prior assumption about people behaving the way they did because of their personality traits than the 4-year-olds did. And once again, this is an example where, paradoxically, the younger kids are actually doing a better job of learning than the older kids are. Just like the kids in our previous experiment, the 4-year-olds were doing a better job of learning than the adults were. And in both cases, the explanation seems to be the same. Once you have a very high prior probability for a particular explanation, it gets to be much harder to actually overturn that explanation in the light of new data. So it may be that just the very fact that as adults, or even as 6-year-olds, we know a lot, is biasing us in a way that means that we don't actually pay attention, as much attention to the evidence, and we can't learn as much from the evidence.
I made my decision already. I mean, I've seen a situation like this, so I made that decision. So by brushing your teeth, how do you do it? You can't explain it to someone else very well, but you probably do it almost exactly the same way we do.
Yeah, as an adult.
As an adult, yeah, and children.
Right, exactly. And exactly the trade-off is if you watch a child brushing their teeth, it's much more complicated because they don't yet have a particular way of doing it they've done over and over again a million times. That makes them less confident, but it also means that they have the potential to do it in a way that's different from the way that they've done it before. And that's exactly the point that I think we're seeing from these experiments with children. So once again, what we're seeing is that the 4-year-olds are actually outperforming the 6-year-olds. They're basing their explanations much more on the data than they are on, the 4-year-olds are basing their explanations more on the data and less on their prior assumptions, those automatic ingrained ideas that they have about how people work than the 6-year-olds are. One of the things that we're doing right now is we're doing this same experiment in China. Because one of the things that we know is that Westerners in particular have a very strong tendency to explain things in terms of traits. A rather nice example of this is people remember there were these incidents of going postal where people in the post office in particular went crazy and started murdering their fellow postal employees. And it was interesting that in America, even though we use this phrase going postal, when you looked at newspaper accounts, they'd say things like, it's strange, he was a quiet guy, but we always thought there was something odd about it. And nobody ever mentioned anything about the post office. In one study that social psychologists did, they actually just looked at translations of the same article, accounts of the same incident in Chinese and American newspapers, one of these going postal incidents. And they discovered that in the Chinese newspapers, people said, well, obviously he was in a terrible workplace and his fellow workers didn't support him, and that was the explanation for why it is that he behaved that way. So one of the things that we're doing now is we're looking in China at children solving these same problems. And one of the things that we're discovering is that the Chinese 6-year-olds are looking more like the American 4-year-olds, which means they're doing better. They're paying attention to the data. They haven't developed this bias that we see in Western adults towards trait explanation. And again, that suggests that part of the issue may be just how much evidence you have. Another part may be that by the time you're 6, and certainly as an adult, you get much more of your information from cultural sources, from what other people tell you, for example, and much less of your information from what you actually see, the evidence that you actually observe. And in a whole other line of experiments that won't talk about, you've shown that even 4-year-olds, if someone actually tells them what the answer to a problem is, are very likely to just accept that answer. If instead of telling them, the person says, I don't know, let's find out, the children are likely to discover more creative, unlikely hypotheses, more creative answers to the problem than they would get if the person was just presented with the answer. So I think the overall story about this is that we're starting to say something about my collaborators and support on this. This is my Tom Griffiths and Clark Lehmer are my computational collaborators on this, and these are all my wonderful graduate students who, of course, actually do all the hard work to get these experiments done. So I think the moral is we actually are starting to understand something about how it's possible for young children to learn as much as they do. They seem to use patterns of evidence in a way that we can predict to use probabilistic patterns of evidence to make inferences not just about specific facts, but about very general principles. And then they use those general principles to make predictions about the world. And I think what this also demonstrates is this trade-off between an approach to learning that is this more exploratory approach with lower priors and approaches to learning that may be better at actually getting things done in a specific way, or get things done efficiently and effectively, but don't give you the option of exploring or learning as much. And I will leave this to you, but I think this has morals for the way that we are both designing computer learning systems, but also morals for the way that we design things like companies or groups who are designed to actually go out and learn, and in particular to learn unexpected or unusual or unlikely things, which is one of the things we want to have happen in a high-tech kind of environment. So a moral that I think that people have already thought about is it's not just that you should think about children as being little scientists, it's that scientists are big children. So if you want innovation and creativity, putting people in the role of children, giving them lots of protected space, giving them lots of opportunities to explore unlikely options, at least to begin with, before you actually get to the planning, production, and marketing stage, might be a really good strategy to pursue.